Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 146 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to have a brief chat with comic book, animation, and novel writer J.M. DeMatteis. While that first conversation was just for me, J.M. was kind enough to agree to a full interview later. Today, you'll hear the first part of that interview, going from his early childhood love of comics and ending with a discussion of one of his best-known stories, Kraven's Last Hunt. You'll be able to hear part 2 in a couple of weeks, unless you're a patron, in which case you can hear the unedited interview in its entirety right now, including our pre- and post-interview conversation. For you regular listeners, however, we begin the interview with something I had been getting wrong up until our conversation: his name. Let me start with something simple. Your name.
You mean how to pronounce my last name, you mean?
DeMatteis?
DeMatteis.
DeMatteis. Okay.
Yes.
Wikipedia has that a little off then.
Yeah, everybody does.
But you're usually credited as J.M.
Right.
DeMatteis.
DeMatteis. It's like I torture people with the pronunciation of my name, you know?
Well, at least you're not Bill Sienkiewicz.
Right. Yeah, but we all know how to say that, don't we?
That's true. All right. So you're usually credited as J.M. DeMatteis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But when I read interviews with people that worked with you, they usually refer to you as Mark.
Some people that know me more intimately call me that. In general, I prefer JM. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you've always kind of gone by JM?
Yeah. I mean, it's a long story because I have a first name, John, which I don't use other than official documents.
Yeah.
Growing up, people called me Mark, but that's my middle name. So as I became a professional, I said JM, and JM became who I am.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I actually do something similar. I'm legally David Curtis, but everyone calls me Kurt.
Right.
And I read you wanted to be a comic book artist from a fairly early age. I'm curious, when did you first start reading comics? Do you remember like the first issue?
I actually was writing something about this recently. I don't remember the first comic book I've ever read because I don't remember not reading comics. They were just always around. But I think even before comics, when I was a kid, like we would get the Sunday New York Daily News, which had a giant comics section, big, full color, page after page of comics. And I think that was my introduction to comics. But, the world I grew up in was very different than this world in that all kids, basically, especially all boys, read comics. We just did. Everyone I knew read comic books. It wasn't like this niche thing over in the corner. And you'd walk in Brooklyn to your local candy store, and there would be a rack of comics there. The magazines are there. The comics are there. You go to the counter and get an egg cream and a stick pretzel and buy a comic, and off you go. And so they were just always a part of my world. So I cannot identify the first comic I ever read. I just can't. Because I don't remember.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I know you stopped drawing regularly before you got into the comics business as a writer, but
my childhood, that was my first passion. Absolutely. I spent many an hour on the living room floor with stacks of paper and crayons and pencils and just drawing. Or when I was young, I remember I'd love to take a comic book, look at the cover, and try to freehand replicate that cover. And that's kind of how I learned to draw. Yeah, so that was a very important part of my identity as a child was the drawing part.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever do any drawing today still?
Aside from doodling, still like to doodle and do little cartoons and things, but nothing serious. Some part of me thinks, at some point it might be nice to just kind of step back and see if I can re-engage that part of my psyche again,
Yeah.
But it's been a long time. But I love to doodle. I go to conventions and I draw little goofy cartoons for people,
Yeah, I know. I just know that some writers like Kurt Busiek, Neil Gaiman occasionally will do like a very rough sketch of a character and give it to an artist and say like, this is kind of what I'm thinking about, and then let the artist work from there.
Well, here's the thing, working in comics, as you know, it's a very visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to think visually. And I actually never thought about this directly before, but the fact that I spent all those years as a kid and teenager drawing, I have a very developed visual sense, which helps me as a writer to look at a page and lay out a page, to react to artwork, to see what works, to see what doesn't, to visualize a scene.
Yeah.
I live in my head. I see stories as movies. I see the visuals moving across the screen in my mind. So I have a very developed visual sense, and that must have, it started with all the drawing I did as a kid. It's interesting. I recently came across, I forgot how somebody mentioned this book on Twitter, but it was a book on drawing for animation. Hadn't thought about it in years, but when I was a kid, I had this book, and it was like the Bible to me. I would sit with this book for hours and draw these characters the way they taught you to draw them in the book. And it's the same thing with writing. I'm also a musician. It's the same thing with music. You enter into another dimension, and that's what it was as a kid on the floor drawing. Was it an hour? Was it 10 hours? Was it a week? You didn't know. You're lost in the creative process.
Yeah.
You're leaving this dimension. You're entering another dimension. It's the same thing when I write. It's the same thing when I play music. And, that to me is just some of the greatest beauty of what life is just engaging creatively that way. And you really, really do. You leave behind this dimension, this alleged reality that we're living in, and you enter into something very, very different. And it's wonderful.
Yeah, I think I get a little touch of that when I'm writing the scripts for the shows, but unfortunately, I've never really had the creative bone that.
I've always said
I'm jealous.
And God made me not very good at anything else. It's like, really good at the creative stuff. Everything else, not so good.
Well, let's start getting into your career here as a comic book writer. One of your earliest published works was Weird War Tales, and you co-created the Creature Commandos, which are now being worked into an animated series in the new DC movie TV universe.
Yeah.
How did that original series come about?
Well, back when I started in comics, I started at DC, and the way to break in was DC had all these anthology comics: Weird War Tales, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, weird everything. They were all they basically they called them mystery comics. They were really horror comics, but because of the code, they couldn't call them horror comics.
Right.
So they called them the mystery books, and so that's how you broke in. So that's where I started working with Paul Levitz. Selling little 5 to 8 page stories for these books. Not the first story I ever sold was House of Mystery. The first story of mine that was printed was actually in Weird War Tales. So probably within the first 6 months that I was selling Paul scripts, you're constantly trying to come up with stories because they're these little stories. You got to keep feeding the beast.
Yep.
And I was just sitting around one day thinking, well, Weird War. Oh yeah. Classic monsters fighting World War II. It seemed like a no-brainer. And I developed this idea. And just before I was going to pitch it to Paul, that's when, if you've heard of the infamous DC implosion that happened back then. So I'm in the business for 6 months. DC implodes. The first people that get cast aside are the people that are the newest. So the door closed. I had no work from them for 8 or 9 months. Maybe more, maybe 9 or 10 months. It was quite a while that I got absolutely no work. And then the door kind of opened a bit and I got back in and I started working with Paul again. And then Len Wein came on staff as an editor, and I started working with Len. And Len and I just got on like a house of fire. He really became my mentor and also my dear friend over time. And he wanted to put some continuing series in both House of Mystery and Weird War Tales. And so for Weird War Tales, I pitched him this crazy idea I had about monsters fighting World War II. He liked it, and we were off. And that was as simple as that. The title, I'm trying to, someone asked me about the title. I don't know if I had the title, if Len came up with the title, if the two of us sat down and bounced around titles. I don't really remember, but that's how Creature Commando started. So it's this like footnote at the very beginning of my career, right? I mean, like
Right.
just it's almost a footnote to a footnote,
Yeah.
And then here we are, whatever it is, 40 years later, and they're developing it into this animated show with talk about moving it into live action. It's like, what? Of all the things I've done, this is the thing.
This is the one.
It's funny, but you know what? It's fun. I'm grateful to see it happen, and so it tickles me, the idea that this thing is being developed from this idea that I had 40 years ago.
Considering how much animated writing you've done,
Yeah.
If they approached you, would you be interested in working on the Creature Commando series?
Oh, sure. Although what I read was, at least for the first season, James Gunn has already written every episode himself.
Oh, wow.
So but if there's more and the opportunity is there, of course, I would love to. I've done, because as you note, I've done tons of animation work.
Yeah. I was just curious if it would be hard working on something that was so far back that you...
No, because you know what? Also, they from what I'm reading, they've changed it considerably. They've evolved it into stuff. So it would be like any other animation gig. Here's our show. Here's what it is. And then you work with what's there. I'm not going back to say, well, why aren't you doing this? I'm going to work with what they're presenting me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like you said, your first work was at DC, but you also started writing some Marvel stories pretty early in your career. Was there a big difference between the two companies at the time?
Well, what happened for me was, while I was starting at DC, I was also trying to get in the door at Marvel, and finally got some samples to Jim Shooter. He liked what he read, and he would throw me these occasional gigs. I did a few fill-in issues of an Iron Man fill-in that never saw print, a Doctor Strange fill-in that eventually did see print. Might have done some other fill-ins as well. And then he would throw me these odd jobs because he liked my work, and he would. So I'm going to sidetrack for a second.
Okay.
The best, weirdest job I ever had was Marvel was suing some animation company over a character called Web Woman, which was a cartoon from the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, which they thought was a ripoff of Spider-Man.
Right.
So Shooter ensconced me in Stan Lee's office. Stan was in California. He gave me my office, Stan Lee's office, and paid me to watch cartoons, Web Woman cartoons, and write up a document about the similarities between Web Woman and Spider-Man.
Wow.
So I got paid to watch cartoons in Stan Lee's office. Does it get better than that?
I don't think so.
2 weeks. For 2 weeks,
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, so through my interactions with Shooter, eventually he offered me a freelance contract.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted me to come over to Marvel exclusively. And it was a tough choice, because at the same time, Len had asked me to come on staff and be his assistant.
Oh, wow.
So it was like, so now I've only been in the business like a year, maybe a year and a half. And all of a sudden I have this choice between a contract at Marvel and going on staff and working with, my mentor and friend, the great Len Wein. It was like, what do I do? Well, the choice was made for me because my son was born right around that time. And long story short, what the decision was, well, if I take this freelance contract, I can be home and be there for my son.
Yeah.
So as hard as it was to say no to Len, I made that choice. And of course, it was the right choice. And so that's what took me over to Marvel.
Now, Jim, as the editor-in-chief, was only 2 years older than you. But
he started writing professionally when he was 13.
Yeah, but he had already been in the industry for 15 years. So
I know, amazing.
Because of all of his experience, did it feel like he was older than he actually was, or did you see him more as a peer?
And he's also, Jim is like what, 6'5", 6'6", something.
He is a large man.
He's got this history in the business. He's towering and slightly intimidating because of his height. But he was very, very kind to me and very welcoming and taught me a lot. He taught me a lot. He was a good person to work with. We had our differences later on, but it never became personal. It was all professional. And
That's good.
he's a very controversial figure for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for me, I look and I weigh the good and the bad in my relationship with Jim. And for me, the good far outweighs the bad.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Yeah, I've talked to various people, and I think overall, I think he has a more positive, especially people who actually worked with him, that he has more of a positive view from the industry on him these days.
Well, here's the deal. We're all human, so nobody's perfect. We're all flawed. Jim had his flaws. I have my flaws. That's just, it's the nature of the beast. Nobody's born without these flaws because we're human. The second thing is, and this is true of anyone who's an editor-in-chief at Marvel or DC or in any position of authority, when you're the guy in the position of authority making the judgment calls, chances are any decision will alienate 50% of the people. It's just the way it goes because you have the power to say yes or no. When you say no, well, I don't agree with that. Why did you do that? So anyone in a position of authority is going to alienate a good percentage of people just the way it is. Look at politics. So I think that's part of it also. It's just by being in that position, you're going to estrange and alienate certain people. Mm-hmm. Sometimes right. Sometimes it's done in such a way that people, the same person could make the same decision and present it in a way that it doesn't alienate somebody, where they understand that somebody else may present it in a way that it does, anger and alienate somebody else. But that's the problem when you have authority and power. It's just the nature of the beast. So, and the truth of the matter is, whatever differences I had with Jim back then, and they weren't that many, but whatever differences I had, I've seen over the years other people in the same sort of positions, and I look at what Jim did and all he accomplished at Marvel overall, and it was pretty extraordinary. He had a really good run there, and he did a lot of really good stuff. So whatever the differences were, they kind of fade with time, and the good stuff at least for me, the good stuff tends to cling, and the other stuff, which seemed very like a big deal at the time, kind of melts away and doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good attitude to have. Now, I'm really curious about something when I was doing my research and everything. One of your early works was a single issue of Star Wars, but in the issue you're credited as Wally Lumbago.
Yes.
Is there a story behind the pseudonym there?
There is a very funny story. Well, again, another one of these things that wasn't that funny at the time. To me, it's a very funny story now. So again, this is even before I think I got the contract at Marvel, but I'd get the occasional gig, and mm-hmm. Louise Simonson, who was Louise Jones then, was the editor of the Star Wars book. Danny Fingeroth, who later became one of my dearest friends in the business, was her assistant. And they asked me if I wanted to do an issue of Star Wars. Shocking revelation. I was never that big a Star Wars fan. I don't dislike Star Wars. I've seen all the movies. I enjoy them, but I don't have that fanaticism that a lot of people have about Star Wars,
Right.
But I came up with a story. And the story, and now my son, talking about my son being a decision maker of this, my son had just been born. His name is Cody. And so I came up with a story about this rebel fighter named Cody Sunchild, Sunnchilde.
Yep.
Not exactly subtle. And the idea had been that he had been with this great rebel fighter, but he had now gone off with his followers. They were in like a parallel dimension, living. Basically, he'd given up the ways of violence for the ways of peace. So Lando Calrissian and the Wookiee end up somehow, in this dimension. They get followed by the Empire guys, and they attack this peaceful compound. And the whole point of the story was, although his first reaction, Cody Sunchild's first reaction, is to fight again, he realized that goes against everything he believes. So he and his followers decide they would rather die for a dream of peace than to fight. A big statement about pacifism and all that, and in a 22-page, Star Wars story.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the story, and it went off to the Lucasfilm people, and it came back, and they said, "You can't do this." They said, having this guy, die as a pacifist makes our characters look bad. How's that? And so they had Louise change this. I guess she changed it, or maybe they put in the change. But if you look at the comic, it says something like, literally, he died for his dream of peace, but he was wrong.
Oh, wow.
Could you imagine that? So it upended the entire point of my story.
Yeah.
Now I look back and I think about this. I'm just starting out in the business. I'm just starting out at Marvel. But I said, I can't have my name on this story. This story goes against everything, the whole intention of the story. Please take my name off it. And I have to say, they were very understanding about it. No one held it against me or anything, and they got it. And so Wally Lumbago was a goofy name that I used to use with my friends, So I put Wally Lumbago on the book, and that's the way it went out. But the PS to the whole story was like 20 years later or 25 years later, I forget when it was, someone, it might have been Brian Cronin at Comic Book Resources, but someone brought it to my attention that the story actually had been published in England exactly the way I wrote it with my name on it.
Oh, wow.
Which I didn't know.
Great.
I didn't know for decades,
Yeah.
So that was the story of Wally Lumbago.
Huh. That's a great story. I'm glad I found that little footnote there.
Yeah.
So some of your first ongoing runs at Marvel were on the Defenders, and of course your legendary run on Captain America with Mike Zeck. When you first started those books, were you a fan of the previous runs? Did you want to read what came before? Did you specifically avoid it? How did you approach starting in on a book that had already been published for so long?
Right. Well, go to the last thing you said. That in the beginning of my career, especially, I don't really do it now.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great excuse to read lots of comics. So if you're like, even when I was at DC, I took over Aquaman. So it was like, I got to go out and buy like 100 back issues of Aquaman. It was just, which of course you do want to read it to inform what you're going to do, but right. It's also just the comic book nerd in me going, oh, more comics to read,
Yeah.
And so in terms of Defenders, I'd always been a huge fan of that book. Especially Steve Gerber's run on that book. Gerber was a huge influence on me because he was a guy who really showed that the parameters of what a superhero comic could be, we thought they were here, they're really here, He just did some phenomenal work. And Captain America too, there were plenty of runs, Steve Englehart's run, Stan and Jack, loved what Stern and Byrne did. They had a very short run, but an amazing run, So I was a fan of those books. I also, at the same time, took over Marvel Team Up and wrote that for like 3 years. So yes, I didn't have to go out for most of those books and buy any back issues because I probably had them and read them. I'd already read them. And so that in terms of research was just being a fan.
Nice. But you said like since then it's kind of changed. You don't do as much of the going back as you did.
Read what I need to read. Let's say if I'm, I'm working on a project for Marvel now that I can't talk about, but whatever I needed, they sent me a bunch of PDFs of the stories that I needed to know in order to do this. Whereas, like once upon a time, I would have gone out and bought 200 issues.
Oh, this is definitely a lot cheaper now.
Yes, it absolutely is. It absolutely is.
Now, back in the early 80s, crossovers were pretty rare still, but you did a small one between Cap and Defenders. What was the process of pitching that kind of idea back then?
Yeah, I don't think I had to pitch anything, really. You know what I mean? It was just like, I'm writing this book. You tell your editors you want to do a story that's going to go back and forth. They're fine, and that's that. Things were a lot more casual then, too.
Okay.
I remember, like, you go through quite a process, pitching books now and getting them approved, and they go through this, and this committee looks at that, and this one looks at that. Mm-hmm. Like, I remember I did an Iceman miniseries back in the 80s, and the way the process on that book was literally, I walked into Jim Shooter's office and said, I want to do an Iceman miniseries. He said, okay. And that was the approval process,
That's a rough one.
Yeah, that was a rough one. That was really, really rough. So no, there was no big jumping through hoops to do that. I was the writer of both those books. So, I wasn't really consciously doing that. But if you look through my Marvel Team Up run, I'm pulling in characters that I worked on Defenders or Captain America, whatever. And, so they all sort of wove together sort of unconsciously creating a little universe between the books that I wrote. And I think a lot of writers did that because we all have the characters that we fall in love with and we want to bring them with us when we go here and we do this and we do that.
Yeah. Well, and that leads perfectly into the next question I had. One of those characters you created was Vermin in Captain America, and then you later used him in Kraven's Last Hunt and multiple times in your Spectacular Spider-Man run.
Right.
Do you remember how you first came up with him and what drew you back to the character time and time again?
I don't remember how I came up with it. I probably was just looking for a new villain, and same way with Creature Commandos. Man Rat, okay, why not? It was this. I don't think it was any more profound than that. Looking for it seemed like a cool, scary, creepy kind of character, and not the usual Captain America villain.
Yeah.
So I used him in a bunch of issues of Captain America. He got involved in this whole storyline we had with Baron Zemo and other stuff. And then I used Captain America and Marvel Team Up and brought Vermin in there, just going back to what we're saying about bringing characters from book to book.
Yeah.
And then when I was doing Kraven's Last Hunt, I needed a character so that I could contrast Peter's vision of Spider-Man with Kraven's vision of Spider-Man. And I thought of Vermin. And because he was a hard character to have compassion for, because he was just so primitive and savage. Although later on I explored the character when we revealed what made him, and then he was a very sympathetic character. But at this point, he was still the kind of crazy cannibal man rat, not like, oh, I understand why you've done what you've done. No, you're a crazy cannibal man rat. And plus, he secreted something that sort of brought out the violent nature in the people around him. And the perfect character to show that, even faced with that, how compassionate Peter was and what a brutal loon Kraven was, So it was a great character to see how they dealt with Vermin. It showed one more thing to illuminate the differences in their characters.
Yeah, it was so well done. It's one of my favorite stories of all time is Kraven's Last Hunt. And obviously it's going to be one of the works that you'll be most remembered for. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Do you remember when the idea for that story came to you?
It was an evolution. But I could tell you the 3-hour version. I'll tell you the 3-minute version instead. The original idea, believe it or not, I pitched a Wonder Man series to Tom DeFalco like in 1983 or 4 or something like that. And it had been established that Wonder Man had died and was somehow regenerated. So I thought, oh, this is a guy that can regenerate. And I loved the relationship between Wonder Man and the Grim Reaper, who was his brother, but also his enemy, kind of like Harry and Peter in Spider-Man, two guys that are deeply emotionally connected and yet they're enemies. So I cooked up this story where the Grim Reaper kills Wonder Man and buries him. And in my original story, it was like for 6 months. He lost 6 months of his life.
Oh, wow.
I don't remember any other details about the story. All I remember is, thank the gods of comics, Tom DeFalco rejected the story. I don't know why, but he did. And it was a great thing that he did, because I always say that stories have lives and timings of their own. And I think I'm in control, but I'm not. That story knew where it needed to go, what characters it had to be and everything. Whereas I didn't. And I played with, what I could do this, as I remember thinking about it as a Doctor Strange story. And then I pitched it as a Batman story to DC, where the Joker kills Batman and buries him. And for whatever reason, it got bounced. So that didn't happen, although that gave me the seeds of another story that I did 10 years later, a Batman story called Going Sane, about the Joker thinking that he killed Batman and his mind snaps and he goes sane.
Right.
All right. So now I've I pitched in Wonder Man, I've gone through Batman, but still there's something about this image of the hero coming back from the grave, that stuck with me. And so then DeFalco called me up, and he and Jim Owsley, who later went on to become Christopher Priest, who was editing the Spider-Man books at the time, took me out to lunch, and they wanted to know if I wanted to write the monthly Spectacular Spider-Man book with Mike Zeck, who I'd worked with on Captain America as the artist. How do you say no to that? And I thought, well, this might be the perfect place to do that story. So I started playing with that idea. And I came up with a new villain. It wasn't Kraven originally. It was a completely new villain that was playing this game with Spider-Man. So I pitched it to Owsley. He said, "Oh, this is great. Let's do this." And then I went home one day, and when I was sitting in my office, this is pre-internet. So I always say, in order to waste time, you had to find other ways to waste time instead of working. There's always something you have to do instead of sitting down and doing your work.
Yeah.
So I was flipping through a stack of comics, and there was a Marvel Universe handbook in my office, and I flipped open to Kraven randomly, and I was reading it, and it said something I'd never heard. Kraven was Russian. Well, I love Dostoevsky. That was like, especially as a young man, that was like, he was the author of authors in my firmament. You look a little like Dostoevsky now that I'm looking at you. You're very similar beard. You have that Dostoevsky look about you. And knowing that Kraven was Russian, suddenly I had this vision of who this character was, because he was not a character that I ever thought about, cared about. In fact, I thought he was one of the goofier Spider-Man villains, was not very. And suddenly I had this vision of I know who this guy is. And I called Owsley up and I said, forget this new villain. We're going to use Kraven. And he was like, but I like the new villain, but it's like, and off I went. And, the story just, certain stories kind of tell themselves.
Yeah.
Like, same thing. We think we're in control, but the story just came together. And also, as I say to people, one of the reasons I think why the story has lasted is because I was going through one of the most painful, awful periods of my life at the time. All that pain was authentic. Peter struggles, Kraven struggles, Vermin struggles, they were all kind of aspects of my psyche and what I was going through at that time. And I think that gave it a certain emotional and psychological authenticity that came through on the page. And of course, the brilliant work that Zek did as a storyteller, and Bob McLeod, and down to Rick Parker and the lettering, and the coloring, everything has to come together. Every element has to come together for a story like that to really, really work. And so that was Kraven's Last Hunt. And, you do in comics, especially then, comics weren't even regularly being collected. So you finish the story, you move on, you're on to the next thing. You're not thinking, I'm going to be talking to you about this story, whatever it is, 35 years later.
Yeah.
And yet here we are.
Here we are.
It's an amazing thing to see it being reprinted and reprinted and reprinted over the years. When I go to conventions, when I did go to conventions in the pre-COVID world, and I encounter people, and still on social media. I just read this for the first time last week. What a fantastic thing. I always say that, once you release a book into the wild, it has nothing to do with you anymore. It's between that story and the audience.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of stories I like better than Kraven's Last Hunt, personally. But the audience resonated with that story. And who am I to argue with them? If this is what they love, then let them love it, and I'm very, very grateful for it.
Yeah.
Not that I don't love the story. I'm just simply saying, there's lots of stories that I've done, that I all love as much or more than Kraven's Last Hunt.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. But I am curious, when you were writing it, how much discussion was there of that ending? Did you need to get permission from somebody to kill Kraven off, especially in the manner that he did it?
That's the amazing thing too. And this partly it's just the 80s, the atmosphere in comics in the 80s, which was very wide open and very creative and very experimental. My memory is I pitched the story, they said fine, and that was that.
Wow.
Nobody said we have to call Stan and see if he's okay for you to kill Kraven. Maybe someone did. If they did, they never told me. Well, my memory is I pitched the story, they loved it, and that was that.
Huh.
And off we went. Yeah.
Now, you came back to the story. You've come back to it a few times, I would say. But there specifically was a sequel that came out called Soul of the Hunter.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's an afterword in the book where you explain why you felt it was kind of important to put the coda on Kraven's story. But do you mind summing up for the reader?
No, not at all.
Listeners, why you felt it was so critical to come back to?
Tom DeFalco, who was editor-in-chief at the time, another one of my dearest pals in the business, got a letter, I think it was just a letter, from some suicide prevention group saying, well, they were very upset about this story because we were glorifying suicide. Not what the story's about, not my intention in any way, shape, or form.
Of course.
It's very, very clear that Kraven is mentally unbalanced. He thinks he's having an honorable death and he's finally fulfilled himself, but that's not the case at all. In fact, the last words he says are, they said my mother was insane. Boom. You know what I mean? Referring back to that there's a history of mental illness in this family.
Mm-hmm. And
that disturbed me that they felt that way. And I'm just the kind of person that once that little worm gets in my head, I'm going to be laying awake at night. Oh, what did I do something wrong with it? I'll agonize over it. And I thought, I want to write a story, like you said, a little coda that will make it very, very clear that that is not what that was about. And so that's where Soul of the Hunter came from.
So you worked with Mike Zeck on Captain America and Kraven's Last Hunt. On Spectacular Spider-Man, you worked with Sal Buscema. I feel like both of those artists aren't as well known as they should be, given the caliber of their storytelling prowess. What were your partnerships with both of them like?
Great. Fantastic. I remember when Mike and I started out on Captain America, the first few months, it was a little bumpy. I wasn't sure about him. He wasn't sure about me. And then something just clicked. And we didn't just become, collaborators, we became friends. And I loved working with him. And we kind of reached the peak on that book right when he left because they pulled him off to go do Secret Wars. And the last thing we did was a Deathlocks 3-part story, which I thought was us. We were going on all cylinders on that one. And then he left and was like, oh, but I realized what we had done for those, however, he was probably on Captain America with me for 2 years, and I did another year after that. It was like going to the gym. We were building up our creative muscles. So when we came back together for Kraven's Last Hunt, those muscles were already there. We could pick up where we left off and take it to another level,
Nice.
So, and I always say it's the same. I'll say the same thing about Sal. Sal, working with Sal for those 2 years was heaven. I'd done some fill-in things with him here and there, but never anything ongoing. And this was Sal at the peak of his form. And Sal and I hit it off from the very beginning. First page, first panel, something magical happened, and that was it. And that's the way it stayed pretty much for 2 years. Both those guys are incredible visual storytellers, meaning, especially if you're working Marvel style. For those that Marvel style is, I write a very detailed plot, sometimes page by page, panel by panel, goes off to the artist. I get the artwork back, and then I put in the final script. I've got dialogue and themes and all that stuff written into the plot, but the beauty of it is I can react to the artwork. Mm-hmm. And when you're working that way, sometimes you'll get the artwork back from people and it's like, I have no idea what's happening on this page. And you'll see the writing over explaining the artwork because the joke line I always use is, characters trips on something and falls off a roof, and you see a balloon like, I've tripped on something and I'm falling off the roof, because it's not clear in the artwork.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with a Mike Zeck or a Sal Buscema, everything is clear, crystal clear. So with Kraven's Last Hunt, I don't have to explain anything that's going on in the artwork. You look at the characters' faces and all the surface emotions are there and very, very clear. So what is Kraven's Last Hunt? That entire story is interior monologue, right? Mm-hmm. I'm down on level 2, level 3, level 4, thoughts, counter thoughts to that, because I don't have to explain what's happening. If someone else had drawn that story, it might not have been able to write it the same way. But because Mike did it, and Mike is such a master, that allowed me to do that deep dive. And Sal, the same thing. I mean, you look at a Sal page, you take all the words out of the story and you know what's happening. Oh, and my classic story with Sal is Spectacular Spider-Man 200, the death of Harry Osborn. Get to the end, and I worked out all the choreography, what's happening on these last 3 pages, and I'm sure it's the death of this major character. I'm going to have to pull out the violins and, really ladle it on thick, the melodrama and the syrup, and just get the violins going. And I got Sal's artwork, and I started to write, and I went, I'm looking at these last 3 pages, and everything that I put in the plot and more is there in the artwork. So there's not a word on those 3 pages.
Yeah.
And that's because I was working with Sal Buscema.
Yeah, I remember picking that book up off the shelves and just how much it hit me those last few pages. It's so well done.
Sal and both. The good thing is also both those guys are really good guys. So it's one thing to work with someone who's immensely talented, but when it turns out that they're also really good people, you can't ask for anything more.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about this until I was writing these questions, but I realized that you wrote the issues that killed off Kraven the Hunter, Harry Osborn, and Aunt May.
I'm a mass murderer.
Did you ever start to feel like Spider-Man's personal Grim Reaper there?
It was not a conscious thing. I never set out, I'm going to kill this one, and this one. It just worked out that way, Yeah, it's funny. The Kraven death stuck for like 25 years. The Harry death stuck for 20 years, and Aunt May's death stuck for about 7.5 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
But all those stories, like the Aunt May story is another story that I'm really, really proud of. And a very similar thing happened with Mark Bagley on that story, in that when you get to the point where after Aunt May's death, and then we see the funeral, and there's 2 or 3 pages about the funeral and the aftermath, and I got these beautiful pages from Bagley, and I realized I don't have to write anything. it's all there in the art. So there's two or three silent pages in the middle of that story. Beautiful work by Mark Bagley, who continues to be, one of the premier Spider-Man artists out there.
Oh, definitely. And just a machine. Can one of those rare artists that can do 2 monthly books at the same time.
Yeah, that's really rare these days. It's really rare. Yeah.
Yeah. We mentioned that all three of these characters have been resurrected at this point. Do you ever feel like those resurrections cheapened your storyline, or do you just kind of accept that that's one of those things that comes with writing a character you didn't create?
It's a shared universe. You know what I mean? And I'm going to write my stories, and someone's going to come after me, and someone's going to come after him or her, and on and on and on and on and on. So sometimes one might be annoyed about it, but it doesn't matter, because in the scheme of things, I've probably done the same thing to another writer's stories and changed something that they didn't like. It's just the nature of working in a shared universe. So it becomes a question of, if they've, brought this dead character back, did they bring him back in an interesting way? Did they create a good story out of that? And, so that's more important in the end, because, as much as you want these, like, I remember when I was writing Captain America, I killed off the Red Skull. In my mind, that was it. The Red Skull was dead and gone. He'd been around for his whatever it was since World War II, and he's gone forever. Because you have to write the story that way. When it's Aunt May, whether it's Kraven, if you're writing that story and you're thinking they're going to bring him back, you can't put your heart and soul into that story, because the death then isn't real. You have to believe that death is real. But somewhere, you're working in a shared universe. These are characters that are, now they're all owned by these big corporations. They're not going to let them stay dead. It's just not going to work that way, But while you're writing that story, you have to believe it 100%. And, as other people have said, those stories are out there. You can pick up that Aunt May story. It doesn't matter that she got resurrected 7.5 minutes later. Does the story stand on its own 2 feet, and does it still work? And I think it does.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. That wraps up the first half of my interview. Thank you, of course, to J.M. DeMatteis for agreeing to sit down with me for this discussion. You can hear the second half in just 2 weeks. There will be a re-release of episode 6 with improved audio in between, where we'll talk about his creator-owned work, writing for TV and animation, his music, and of course, his legendary run on Justice League with Keith Giffen, Kevin Maguire, and others. In the meantime, I'm always looking for more questions for the regular scripted episodes of the show. If there's a topic you'd like me to get into, whether it be on comics, board games, role-playing, or any other geeky subject, let me know. You can email me at welcometogeektown@gmail.com, or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown, Twitter @geektownpodcast, or Mastodon @welcometogeektown @mastodon.social. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, why not become a patron at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them,
welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All of their sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.